Hello and welcome, dear listener, to another journey into the curious, the forgotten, and the oddly intimate corners of history. Tonight, we will step softly into the world of the Middle Ages, but not through the grand halls of kings or the chaos of battlefields. No, this time, we are going somewhere quieter, dimmer, more personal. We are going to explore the strange and fascinating bedtime rituals of medieval people. But before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. If you enjoy falling asleep to these slow, wandering paths through the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might imagine. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. I always love to imagine these stories reaching listeners scattered across cities, countrysides, mountains, and coastlines, all settling into bed with the same quiet hum of curiosity. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and imagine it is centuries ago. The sun has set behind the village, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets. The air is cooler now, smelling faintly of wood smoke, damp earth, and the last baking loaves of the day. You are inside a small timber-framed house, or perhaps in a stone manor, or even under a low thatched roof, wherever you find yourself. The day's work is done, and the world is preparing for sleep. But bedtime in the medieval world was never simple. It was a time threaded with ritual, habit, and belief, some of it practical, some of it utterly strange to our modern minds. In many parts of Europe, the first thing to do before sleep was to check the bed itself. And I do not mean fluffing pillows or straightening sheets. Beds were often shared not just by spouses or families, but by servants, guests, or even travelers who paid for a space. So before lying down, a medieval sleeper might shake out the straw mattress, partly to smooth it, partly to drive out unwanted insects or worse. In wealthier homes, where beds were constructed with carved wood frames, curtains were drawn tightly around the mattress. This was not just for warmth, but for privacy. Since a room might have multiple beds and multiple sleepers, the curtain also kept out drafts and, in some beliefs, spirits that drifted through the night air. The act of drawing them close could be almost ceremonial, accompanied by a whispered prayer or a charm. Lighting before bed was another matter entirely. Candles and oil lamps were expensive. Many relied on the last embers of the hearth for their light. In some households, it was believed unlucky to blow out a candle with your breath. It might invite bad dreams or evil omens, so they would be snuffed with an iron tool. The bed itself might be warmed with a metal pan filled with glowing coals, slid between the sheets for a few moments, a luxury that only the more prosperous could afford. For poorer families, the warmth came from sleeping close together, children piled in with parents, or siblings huddled beneath a single coarse blanket. But warmth was not the only concern. Night was a time when the invisible world seemed closer, when demons, witches, and restless dead were believed to wander. Many people performed small protections before lying down. In England, some would place a knife under the pillow, blade facing outward, to ward off evil spirits. In France, a sprig of rosemary might be tied above the bed to protect against nightmares. In Germany, a small piece of bread could be placed on the windowsill as an offering, in hopes that no mischievous sprite would trouble the house. The medieval concept of bedtime was also different from ours. Artificial light was minimal, and so people often followed what historians call segmented sleep. They would go to bed shortly after nightfall, sleep for a few hours, wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two, sometimes to pray, sometimes to talk quietly, sometimes even to visit neighbors, and then sleep again until dawn. This midnight waking was known simply as the watch and was considered a normal part of life. It was in those dark, in-between hours that some of the strangest rituals occurred. A farmer might stir from bed, stoke the fire, and check on livestock. A housewife might kneel by the hearth, murmuring prayers for her family's health. Some believed that the time between the first sleep and the second sleep was when the veil between worlds was thinnest, and so charms for protection, love, or prosperity were most effective. Then there were the more curious customs, the ones that seem almost humorous now. In certain towns, there was a belief that turning one's mattress 3 times before lying down would confuse the devil, preventing him from finding you in your sleep. In rural Italy, parents might tell children to whisper a goodnight to the moon so they would not wet the bed. In the Baltic regions, young women might place a sprig of dill under their pillow to dream of their future husband. In monasteries, bedtime followed an entirely different rhythm. Monks lived by the bells, and the final prayer of the day, Compline, was a solemn ritual. After it, silence was kept until morning, broken only by the chanting of the night offices. Beds were simple, often just a wooden plank with a thin layer of straw, and the act of lying down was considered a moment of humility, a rehearsal for death itself. Even the position of the body mattered. Some monks slept on their backs, hands folded over their chests, as if in a coffin. And yet, despite the austerity, even monasteries had their peculiarities. In some abbeys, it was believed that sleeping with a holy relic nearby could protect the soul from temptation during dreams. Elsewhere, a monk might be assigned to watch the dormitory through the night, ensuring that all remained orderly and that no one strayed into forbidden conversations. All of these practices, strange, charming, sometimes unsettling, formed the nightly rhythm of medieval life. And while they may seem distant to us now, they speak to something universal: the desire to make the night safe, to turn the vulnerable act of sleep into something protected and meaningful. Because in an age when the dark was deeper and the world felt more mysterious, bedtime was never just the end of the day, it was an encounter with the unknown. If you close your eyes now and let the room around you fade, imagine the medieval night not as we know it today, but as it truly was: black, heavy, and alive with the creak of timbers, the crackle of dying fires, the soft breathing of those nearby. The darkness was not uniform. It seemed to press harder in certain corners, as if shadows themselves had weight. And into this thick night stepped traditions that were as much about survival as they were about comfort. In the villages of northern France, the bed was a place not only to rest, but to shield the body from cold and damp, which were believed to cause illnesses. Before lying down, some families would hang thick woolen drapes, not only around the bed but also across the entire sleeping area to trap heat. In more humble homes, they might drape animal skins over the sleeping space, their smell strong but their warmth undeniable. In wealthier households, the bedding itself could be layered in an elaborate way: first a straw mattress, then a feather bed, then heavy linen sheets, followed by thick woolen blankets and perhaps a fur coverlet. For them, the bed was an investment, and so it was cared for as one would care for any costly possession. In parts of England and Scotland, there was an added layer of belief that beds should never face directly toward the door. This was considered unlucky, for the position mirrored the way coffins were carried out at funerals. Superstition was woven into the way a bed was placed, how a sleeper lay, and even what they wore. Night clothes were not the airy garments of modern imagination. They were thick shifts or tunics, sometimes with hoods, designed to retain body heat in rooms that might drop near freezing. Yet even in such practical garments, a touch of ritual remained. Pockets sewn into the inside might hold a charm, a saint's medallion, or even a small clove of garlic, thought to repel illness and evil spirits alike. In the Germanic lands, one curious custom involved bed prayers that were recited in a fixed order. These were not merely religious. They were protective formulas, invoking the Virgin Mary, angels, or specific saints, known for guarding against nightmares. Some households kept a small crucifix nailed to the headboard, and it was considered dangerous to sleep without crossing oneself 3 times before closing the eyes. The reasoning was simple. Dreams were not merely the mind's wanderings, but a space where demons could intrude if one was not properly guarded. And then there was the practice of the watch drink. In some towns, particularly in colder climates, a warm beverage was prepared just before bed, not the tea or cocoa of today, but a mixture of warmed ale or milk with spices, often cinnamon, nutmeg, or clove. This was believed to settle the stomach, induce drowsiness, and keep the body warm through the night. but it also had a symbolic function. Sharing it among family members or servants before bed was a small nightly gathering, a way of closing the day together. The rural communities of Italy had their own bedtime peculiarities. In the countryside of Tuscany, families often kept animals, goats, chickens, sometimes even small pigs inside the same room where they slept. This was partly for warmth, partly for protection from theft, but it changed the bedtime atmosphere entirely. Falling asleep meant drifting into the chorus of animal sounds, the shifting of hooves, the soft rustle of feathers, the occasional bleat or cluck. It was said that the presence of animals could also ward off evil spirits, for the creatures would sense them before humans could. In coastal fishing towns, bedtime was influenced by the tides. Sailors and their families would sometimes go to bed not according to the hour, but according to the ebb and flow of the sea. When a tide change was due at night, it might mean waking midway through to help secure nets or boats. In such places, the idea of an uninterrupted night's sleep was foreign. Rest came in shifts, and rituals adapted to that rhythm. Meanwhile, in the icy reaches of Scandinavia, bedtime customs reflected the deep winter darkness. People there often kept an oil lamp or small tallow candle burning through the night, not only for light, but to keep frost from forming on the bedclothes. The flame was also thought to discourage spirits of the dead from lingering too close. In some households, children were told that if the light went out, the night walkers' restless, ghostly figures could slip in and whisper nightmares into their ears. And so, the small, steady flame became a companion through the long winter nights. Yet perhaps the most intriguing aspect of medieval bedtime was the belief that dreams were messages sometimes divine, sometimes dangerous. To control what one dreamed, people took deliberate steps before sleeping. A person might place certain herbs under the pillow mugwort to invite prophetic dreams, valerian to keep nightmares away, rose petals for dreams of love. In some towns, people believed that sleeping with one's head to the north and feet to the south would ensure a restful night, while reversing the position could bring visions or omens. These rituals might seem quaint to us now, but for medieval people, they were as real and necessary as locking a door. The night was full of uncertainty, and in a world lit only by fire and moonlight, rituals were a way to claim some measure of control over what could not be seen. It was not just about falling asleep, it was about crossing safely into the vulnerable realm of dreams and waking again to the promise of morning. In the dim corners of the medieval night, there were rituals so strange, so layered in superstition and secrecy, that they blurred the lines between religion, folklore, and something far older. In some rural hamlets of Eastern Europe, the night was not approached passively, it was negotiated with. People believed that before closing one's eyes, the spirits of the land needed to be acknowledged, lest they grow restless. This might mean stepping outside briefly, even in the cold, to whisper a short phrase to the wind, or to touch the ground with bare hands, as if to reassure the earth that its human inhabitants were grateful for another day. In villages along the Carpathians, the practice took on a darker tone. A small bowl of bread soaked in milk would be left at the threshold for the night feeders, invisible beings who would otherwise slip in to sap one's strength during sleep. Families swore that if the offering was missing in the morning, their dreams had been free of terrors. In certain Germanic towns, the preparation for bed could resemble a small theatrical performance. Candles were not snuffed out all at once, each was extinguished with a spoken charm, often the same words every night, passed down through generations. The final candle, often the one nearest the bed, was put out only after crossing oneself and whispering the name of a deceased relative, a call for protection. The belief was that the dead, if remembered nightly, could stand guard at the threshold of dreams. In the monasteries, bedtime rituals had a different gravity. Monks adhered to the great silence, speaking no words after the final prayers. Yet before sleep, they engaged in small private actions meant to purify the mind. Some would wash their hands and face in cold water, not merely for cleanliness, but to wash away impure thoughts before the vulnerable hours of sleep. A few orders believed in sleeping fully clothed as a sign of readiness should God call them to judgment in the night. In certain abbeys, each monk lay with his hands crossed over his chest, as if already in death. In the courts of nobility, rituals became a curious blend of luxury and fear. Bedchambers were often vast, drafty, and filled with shadows, and even with guards outside, the sense of vulnerability lingered. Nobles might have a personal night servant whose sole duty was to check the bed for any harmful objects, a shard of glass, a cursed trinket slipped under the mattress, or even a dead animal planted there by an enemy. Poison in bed was not unknown, and so this nightly inspection became an unspoken necessity. The bed itself might be blessed with a few drops of holy water or perfumed with crushed lavender and rosemary, believed to both soothe the senses and banish ill will. And then there were the dream-manipulating rituals that bordered on the occult. In certain pockets of France, those who wished to dream of a specific person, perhaps a lover, perhaps a future spouse, would place an item of that person's clothing on their pillow, along with a sprig of thyme, while reciting a verse. The verse varied, but the intent was always to call the person into one's dream. If the dream came, it was taken as a sign of fate. Not all dream rituals were gentle. In parts of Ireland, some believed in the night trial, where one would deliberately invite a troubling dream to test their courage. This meant placing a stone from a crossroads under the pillow and going to bed without speaking a word after sunset. The dreams that followed were said to reveal one's spiritual strength or weakness. Among the lower classes, where superstition clung most tightly, the night was seen as a hunting ground for forces that could not be named aloud. People would tie small bundles of herbs, often a mix of sage, rue, and St. John's wort, and hang them above the bed, the scent sharp and earthy. It was thought that evil could not cross a threshold scented with these plants. In fishing villages, nets were sometimes draped loosely above sleeping areas, as if to catch wandering spirits before they could reach the sleeper. In the warm regions of the Mediterranean, where the air itself seemed alive after dark, bedtime rituals were infused with a sense of the unseen. In Sicily, families would sweep the floor just before bed not to clean, but to sweep out lingering spirits that might have followed them home. The broom was left bristles up against the door to confuse any ghost who tried to enter. In some towns, the final act before sleeping was to pour a small glass of water and place it on the windowsill. This was not for drinking, it was a symbolic offering, a cooling gesture to wandering souls. And throughout all of medieval Europe, there was the unshakable belief that certain nights were more dangerous than others. The eves of major feast days, the turning of the seasons, and especially the night before All Hallows were times when the veil between worlds was said to thin. On such nights, bedtime rituals grew longer, prayers more fervent, charms more numerous. People slept lightly, if at all, listening to the shifting sounds in the dark, wondering if they were entirely alone in their chambers. What we see, looking back, is that these rituals, whether grand or humble, were all rooted in the same need: to make the night safe, to transform the bed from a place of vulnerability into a guarded sanctuary. In the medieval mind, the act of going to sleep was not passive. It was a crossing into another realm, one that required preparation, allies, and defenses. And as the last candle guttered and the room filled with darkness, each sleeper stepped across that threshold, carrying with them the hope that they would wake again to the light of morning. Night in the Middle Ages was not merely the absence of sunlight. It was an entire realm of its own, a realm ruled by darkness, silence, superstition, and habit. As the final hours of daylight waned, the medieval world began a slow transformation. The market squares emptied, gates to walled towns clanged shut, and the streets became eerily still except for the occasional shuffle of feet or the distant bark of a dog. People of all classes understood that what followed after sunset was not merely rest, it was ritual. These bedtime customs varied dramatically depending on wealth, social status, region, and even personal belief, but they shared one common truth. In an era without electric light, and in a world bound tightly to nature's rhythms, the night was something to be approached deliberately, even cautiously. In noble households, the approach to sleep began well before anyone touched a bed. Servants moved quietly through drafty halls, pulling heavy curtains to keep the cold at bay, shutting thick shutters over windows, and placing iron braziers in rooms so that embers might take the edge off the night chill. The master of the house might sip a warm, spiced drink mulled wine infused with cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves, believed to ease digestion and promote a calm mind. In some castles, small trays of sweetmeats or soft cheese would be left in the bedchamber as a late treat, for it was thought that a satisfied stomach encouraged peaceful dreams. Meanwhile, the lady of the house might be attended by a maid who brushed her hair, a practice as much about vanity as it was about preventing tangles that could worsen during the night. The bed itself was not merely a piece of furniture. For the wealthy, it was a statement. Great wooden frames carved with intricate patterns were piled high with feather mattresses, linen sheets, and woolen blankets. Many noble beds were also curtained not purely for privacy, but to create a cocoon of warmth and safety. The curtains could block out drafts, muffle sound, and give the sleeper a sense of enclosure, an important comfort in an era when night was associated with vulnerability. For common folk, the rituals were simpler but no less deliberate. In small cottages, the family bed might be shared by parents and children, sometimes even with grandparents or visiting relatives. The hearth fire would be banked to smolder through the night, and beds would be padded with straw, covered with whatever blankets could be afforded, often coarse wool. Before lying down, some families would recite prayers together, invoking protection from thieves, fire, and evil spirits. The act of crossing oneself before bed was deeply ingrained, and for many, the last words spoken each night were petitions to saints or to the Virgin Mary. In villages, the sounds of night carried far low murmurs of conversation from neighboring cottages, the creak of wood, the scurry of mice, the far-off howl of a wolf. These noises were not always comforting. To many, they were reminders that the world beyond the safety of walls was unpredictable and dangerous. One peculiar ritual, especially in colder regions, involved warming the bed with a metal pan filled with embers, slid between the sheets shortly before sleep. This bed warmer was a luxury, and for those without such tools, hot stones wrapped in cloth could serve the same purpose. Some households used warmed bricks, taking them straight from the hearth to the bed. The belief that warmth aided not just comfort, but health, was strong. Cold and damp were considered causes of illness, and many took precautions to avoid sleeping in a chill room. Sleep itself was often segmented into two phases: first sleep and second sleep. This pattern was not a quirk of a few, but a widespread medieval habit, born of the long dark nights. People would sleep for several hours, then wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night before returning to bed. During this wakeful period, sometimes called the watch, people might pray, read, tend to small chores, even visit neighbors. In noble households, guards would make rounds, and in monastic communities, monks would rise to chant the night offices. Among the peasantry, the watch could be a time for quiet conversation between spouses or the tending of animals. Superstitions surrounded this in-between time. It was believed that the hours between midnight and dawn were when the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest. Some feared leaving the bed during these hours, while others embraced the quiet solitude as a time for reflection or even courtship. Herbal remedies also played a role in bedtime rituals. Lavender, chamomile, and valerian were known to be calming, and were sometimes placed under pillows or brewed into teas. In wealthier homes, small sachets of dried herbs might be tucked into bed linens, both for their pleasant scent and their supposed ability to ward off pests. For those less fortunate, the same effect might be sought with simple bundles of mint or rosemary from the garden. Cleanliness, though not universally observed by modern standards, was still part of some bedtime routines. The wealthy might wash their feet in warm water scented with herbs before bed, both to soothe and to remove the day's grime. This practice was especially common in warmer months, when dust and sweat accumulated easily. In contrast, poorer folk might simply wipe their feet on a cloth and call it sufficient. The act of preparing for bed was also a time to secure the home. Doors were bolted, shutters closed, and tools or valuables stored safely. In rural areas, livestock was often brought into close proximity, either in an adjoining space or, in colder months, directly into the main room, adding warmth but also a cacophony of nocturnal sounds. In cities, the night watch patrolled the streets, but few placed full trust in their protection, making self-reliance essential. Dreams were another important part of the medieval bedtime experience. Many believed dreams carried messages, either divine or ominous. People might perform small rituals to encourage good dreams, placing a Bible under the pillow, for instance, or sleeping with certain charms. Conversely, some took measures to ward off nightmares, which were thought to be caused by demons or malevolent spirits known as night hags. In such cases, an amulet or the sign of the cross was considered essential defense. The bedchamber itself could be as sparse or as elaborate as circumstances allowed. In monasteries, beds were simple pallets in communal dormitories, and bedtime was marked by strict silence. In contrast, the chambers of kings and queens were richly adorned, often with tapestries depicting biblical scenes or hunts, not just for decoration but for insulation. Here, bedtime was as much a performance as it was a private act. Attendance might be present until the final moments before sleep. Even in such opulence, however, the underlying principles of medieval bedtime rituals remained constant: preparation, protection, and a kind of surrender to the mysteries of the night. Sleep was not entered into lightly. It was a passage into vulnerability, and every custom, from the humblest peasant's prayer to the most elaborate noblewoman's hairbrushing, was an attempt to make that passage safer, warmer, and perhaps a little more peaceful. And so, as candles guttered and the last embers glowed faintly in the hearth, the medieval world settled into its long conversation with the dark each sleeper, surrounded by the traditions, fears, and comforts that shaped their nightly journey from waking into the unknown. If the late evening in the medieval world was a careful retreat into the safety of walls and the warmth of the hearth, then the deep night was a time suspended between fear and familiarity. Once the bedchambers had gone quiet and the sounds of daily work faded, a different kind of life began to stir not only among the people who kept watch or woke during the night, but among the superstitions and whispered beliefs that thrived in darkness. Bedtime, to medieval minds, was not simply about lying down and closing one's eyes. It was an entry into a liminal space where the physical and spiritual worlds overlapped. To understand these rituals, one must first accept that the medieval night was alive with unseen presences. From England to the far reaches of Eastern Europe, people feared what might pass over their sleeping bodies. Tales of night hags who sat on the chests of sleepers to steal their breath were common across cultures. To ward them off, households might hang sprigs of protective herbs, rue, rosemary, or juniper above the bed. In some cases, shoes were placed at the foot of the bed, pointing away from the sleeper, to confuse wandering spirits or fairies that might try to approach. The orientation of the bed itself could be subject to ritual consideration. In many regions, it was believed best to sleep with one's head to the east, aligning with the rising sun and the direction of Christ's resurrection. Sleeping with the head to the west, on the other hand, was considered unlucky or even an invitation to death, as corpses were often buried facing that way. In poorer homes, where space dictated sleeping arrangements more than superstition, such rules were sometimes bent, but the awareness of them remained. For many medieval people, the act of entering bed was accompanied by words of protection. These might be formal prayers in Latin for those who could recite them, or simple spoken charms for the illiterate. One might murmur, "Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on," while making the sign of the cross over the sheets. In Scandinavia, similar bedtime invocations called upon saints and angels to guard each corner of the sleeper's bed. The sense of vulnerability was heightened by the knowledge that night was the hour when disease might take a sudden turn, when wounds could fester unseen, when childbirth dangerous at any hour often struck without warning. In such cases, women might keep certain objects close by during sleep. A blessed candle stub, a relic of a saint, or a strip of cloth tied with a protective knot. In wealthier homes, where privacy allowed more elaborate habits, bedtime could involve personal attendants ensuring not only comfort, but security. Locks on bedchamber doors were not universal, and so trusted guards might be stationed nearby. In some noble households, the bed was equipped with a canopy not only for warmth, but also for defense. A thick wooden frame could support curtains heavy enough to slow an intruder or conceal movement within. The fabric itself was often embroidered with symbolic motifs: vines for life, lions for courage, or crosses for divine protection. Meanwhile, in monasteries, the transition to night was marked by bell tolls that signaled the beginning of the Great Silence. Monks would retire to their narrow cots and communal dormitories, often still wearing some of their habits for warmth. Beds were simple, but even here, ritual infused the act of sleeping. Before lying down, a monk would stand for a final silent prayer, committing his soul to God in case he did not wake. In rural villages, where homes were often one-room structures, the family bed was a crowded place. Children slept at the foot of their parents' bed or alongside siblings. Privacy was almost non-existent, and the physical closeness of bodies was the primary defense against cold. In these households, bedtime rituals could be communal stories told aloud, lullabies sung, prayers said in unison. The very smell of the room wool blankets, smoke from the hearth, the earthy scent of packed dirt floors was part of the atmosphere of night. In some parts of Europe, it was believed that eating certain foods before bed could influence dreams. Cheese was often said to bring strange or vivid visions. In England, a piece of Stilton might be avoided for fear of nightmares. Sweet spiced milk, however, was thought to invite pleasant, even prophetic dreams. In noble circles, it was not uncommon for dream books manuscripts that interpreted the meaning of dreams to be kept close to the bed, ready to be consulted at dawn. Perhaps one of the most curious aspects of medieval sleep was the acceptance of segmented rest. The wakeful interval between first and second sleep was fertile ground for rituals that would seem strange today. Some couples used the time for intimacy, believing the body was more relaxed and fertile during these hours. Others rose to tend animals, check that doors were secure, or stir the hearth so embers could last until morning. In some places, people deliberately drank a small amount of ale or watered wine upon waking, believing it kept the body warm for the second sleep. Night lighting was scarce and precious. Candles made from tallow were cheap but foul-smelling. Beeswax candles burned more cleanly and brightly but were expensive. In wealthier homes, a small night lamp, an oil-filled dish with a floating wick, might be kept burning all night, casting a soft glow over the bedchamber. The poor relied on the dim orange light of the banked hearth, or else embraced complete darkness. Shadows, however, could play tricks on the mind, and it was not unusual for people to believe they had seen figures moving at the edge of the light, especially in the half-conscious moments before or after sleep. Protection from physical dangers was also part of nightly ritual. Before retiring, weapons might be placed within arm's reach. A dagger beneath a pillow, a staff beside the bed. In times of unrest, some families slept in shifts, so that one person was always awake to guard the household. In fortified manors, guards paced the walls, their distant footfalls a reminder that safety was never taken for granted. Not all bedtime customs were rooted in fear. Many were simply practical habits born of the era's realities. Hair was often braided before bed to prevent tangles. In winter, socks or cloth wrappings kept feet warm. In some regions, people wore nightcaps to conserve body heat, especially in drafty homes. Woolen caps were common, but wealthier folk might have them made from soft linen, sometimes embroidered. The bed itself, for those who could afford it, might be layered with remarkable complexity. A bottom mattress stuffed with straw, above it a feather bed, then sheets of linen, blankets of wool, and finally, a heavy coverlet. Each layer had to be arranged before bed, a small ceremony in itself. And then there were the unspoken rules of sleeping with others. In crowded conditions, the order in which people lay down could be dictated by age, status, or gender. In inns, or during travel, strangers might share a bed, leading to an etiquette of silent tolerance, turning one's face away, keeping arms close, avoiding conversation after the initial greeting. For travelers, carrying one's own blanket was common, as beds in public houses could be rough, damp, or infested with lice. Indeed, the fight against bed pests was a nightly concern. Herbs tucked into mattresses, bed frames rubbed with vinegar, and even the placement of bed legs in bowls of water were methods to keep insects at bay. The smell of lavender or mint in the bedchamber was as much about masking unpleasant odors as it was about comfort. By the time the second sleep ended and the faint light of dawn began to touch the horizon, the medieval sleeper had often moved through layers of ritual, belief, and habit that shaped the night into something more than rest. It was a journey part physical, part spiritual through hours, ruled by both the intimate familiarity of daily custom and the deep, unshakable mystery of the dark. While the essential patterns of medieval night were shaped by shared human needs: warmth, safety, and rest, the specific bedtime rituals of different regions, classes, and professions created a patchwork of customs that could seem almost alien to the modern mind. In towns where streets were narrow and houses pressed close together, the night car ride a texture of sound and smell that wove itself into the process of falling asleep. Bakers began work before dawn, and the scent of yeast and smoke could drift through shuttered windows. Watchmen patrolled with rattles or bells to announce their presence, their footsteps echoing between timbered walls. For the urban poor, the bed was often a pallet rolled out on the floor, shared with family or even neighbors in cramped quarters. Privacy was a luxury unknown, and thus personal bedtime rituals were often abbreviated. A quick crossing of oneself, a whispered plea to a patron saint, and then surrender to sleep amid the background murmur of the city. Rural nights, by contrast, were almost oppressively silent, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog, the hoot of an owl, or the far-off howl of wolves, in regions where they still roamed. Here, bedtime might involve practical measures born of isolation. Farmers often brought small livestock indoors during the coldest months. The bleating of sheep or the lowing of a cow could be part of the lullaby. In some places, chickens were kept in the same room as the family, both for warmth and for protection against theft. This mingling of human and animal life gave rural night its own distinctive rhythm and scent, and shaped bedtime customs around tending to creatures before tending to oneself. The superstitions that surrounded the act of sleeping were rarely static. They blended religious doctrine with folk belief, creating hybrid rituals. In parts of France and Italy, for example, people believed that sprinkling holy water on the bed before lying down would prevent demons from visiting during the night. This was not an official church teaching, but priests rarely discouraged it. It was better for the faithful to feel protected than vulnerable. In the Germanic lands, an older pagan tradition persisted in some valleys. Before bed, people might knock 3 times on the wooden bed frame to ward off malicious spirits. The knock was accompanied by a phrase invoking protection, sometimes whispered so quietly it became a personal charm known only to the speaker. Clothing, or the lack of it at bedtime, was also subject to custom and belief. In colder climates, sleeping in one's day clothes was common among the poor, as owning separate garments for night was a luxury. But in some regions, particularly among the wealthy, there was a belief that sleeping unclothed allowed the body to breathe and the humors to balance properly. Physicians of the medieval period often gave contradictory advice on this matter, and so personal practice varied widely. Dreams themselves were considered significant events, not just idle fantasies. A troubling dream could prompt someone to rise in the middle of the night, light a candle, and recite a prayer to erase its influence. In noble courts, certain dreams were thought to be omens, and dream interpreters might be consulted in the morning. To encourage favorable dreams, some sleepers placed small charms beneath their pillows, a scrap of parchment with a saint's name, a carved piece of jet or amber, or even a fragment of a church relic. Another layer of ritual was tied to the concept of night air. It was widely believed that air at night was dangerous, especially in urban environments. Physicians warned that it carried disease and corruption into the body. As a result, many people closed shutters tightly and even stopped up gaps in walls with cloth before bed. Some went so far as to place fragrant herbs near their noses as they slept, hoping to purify the air they breathed. This belief influenced the architecture of sleeping spaces. Small windows, heavy curtains, and enclosed bed frames were not only for warmth, but for perceived health. In monastic settings, the approach to night was more regimented and austere. After compline, the final prayer service of the day, monks retired in silence. The dormitory was a shared space, but the arrangement of beds or cots often allowed a degree of separation. Each monk slept in his habit or in a simple shift, and some orders required sleeping with a rope belt on, as a sign of humility and readiness for prayer even in the dead of night. Monks rose for the midnight office of matins, breaking their rest in a way that mirrored the segmented sleep of the lay population but with a spiritual focus. Knights, soldiers, and travelers had their own variations on bedtime. A knight might sleep in a tent during a campaign, his armor close at hand and a sword within easy reach. Even in peacetime, those accustomed to the dangers of the road or battlefield often maintained the habit of sleeping lightly, waking at small noises. In castles, guards on night watch were relieved at intervals, and the sound of their boots on stone could be oddly reassuring to those within the walls. In the Mediterranean world, the warmth of the climate altered bedtime practices significantly. Sleeping outdoors on terraces or rooftops during hot summer months was common, and so rituals for protection against insects and evil spirits took on different forms, such as burning specific herbs nearby or drawing protective symbols on the ground. In the colder north, however, the emphasis was on conserving heat. Beds might be shared not only by family but by guests or even strangers, a practice that was socially accepted though it required careful etiquette. In both cases, the sense of night as a time of vulnerability remained constant, and so the small acts performed before closing one's eyes, crossing oneself, arranging amulets, checking the door, took on deep significance. The medieval bedchamber, whether grand or humble, was thus a microcosm of belief, necessity, and habit. It was the place where all the day's labors ended and where the unseen world felt closest. The canopy over the bed might be richly embroidered or a simple rough cloth, but it marked the boundary between waking and sleeping, between the world of light and the world of shadow. Those who lived in that age would have understood without question that what happened in those hours shaped not only the body's rest, but the soul's well-being. And as the second sleep gave way to the first pale light of morning, each person emerged from the night carrying the weight of their rituals, some protective, some comforting, some simply habitual, into the day ahead. The medieval understanding of night was inseparable from the perception of danger that darkness brought, and this perception seeped into nearly every bedtime ritual, shaping them into small acts of defense against an unseen world. It was not merely the fear of thieves or wild animals that haunted the hours after sunset, it was the belief that night belonged to forces beyond human control. In villages, elders would speak in hushed tones about the hours of the dead, a span between midnight and the cock's first crow, when spirits were thought to roam freely. To cross open ground alone during that time was to invite misfortune, and so households took care to secure their sleeping spaces before the shadows deepened. In wealthier homes, doors were reinforced with iron bolts, while in humbler dwellings, a simple wooden bar or even a heavy chest pushed against the entrance had to suffice. Before retiring, people would check these barriers, not only to keep out intruders, but also to symbolically shut out malevolent forces. Children might be told to stay clear of windows at night lest they catch the gaze of a wandering spirit. This belief was strong enough in some areas that windows were covered entirely after sundown. Alongside these physical precautions existed a set of spiritual defenses. In Christian Europe, the sign of the cross was universal, but it could be supplemented by placing a crucifix at the head of the bed or hanging a palm frond, blessed on Palm Sunday, above the doorway. In Eastern Europe, it was common to keep a small icon near the pillow, often depicting a protective saint such as Saint Nicholas or Saint George. These objects were not just devotional, they were considered to be literal shields against demonic harassment or the infamous night hag that folklore blamed for nightmares and sleep paralysis. For those who could afford it, bedtime was also the moment to consult charms and remedies prescribed by healers. Small cloth pouches containing dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, rue were tied to bedposts to ward off evil and promote restful sleep. The fragrance was believed to strengthen the body's natural defenses, making it harder for sickness or spiritual harm to take root during the vulnerable hours of night. Folk healers might advise placing a knife under the bed with the blade facing outward to cut the path of evil spirits. In some regions, a bowl of water by the bedside was thought to trap wandering souls before they could do harm. The arrangement of the bed itself was a matter of ritual. Many medieval people believed it was bad luck to sleep with one's head facing north, as this was the direction associated with cemeteries and the realm of the dead. Beds were placed so that the sleeper's head was toward the east, aligning with the rising sun and symbolizing the hope of resurrection. In small cottages, this was not always practical, but even a straw pallet might be adjusted to meet this principle whenever possible. Firelight played an important role in the transition from waking to sleeping. In households fortunate enough to have a hearth in the sleeping room, the embers were carefully banked before bed, covered with ashes to keep them glowing until morning. This was done partly for warmth, but also to ensure that the fire seen as a protective presence did not go out entirely during the night. The final glow of the coals cast flickering shadows on the walls, and many believed this dim light discouraged malevolent entities from entering. Candles, on the other hand, were typically extinguished before sleep to prevent accidents, though in some superstitious households, a small, blessed candle was allowed to burn low on holy days as a symbolic light against the dark. Among the peasantry, bedtime often coincided with the completion of tasks that could not wait until morning. A farmer might sharpen tools by the fire, mend harness straps, or prepare seed grain for the next day. Only after these chores was the family ready to settle down. Children were sometimes told short prayers or rhymes meant to guard them as they slept, simple verses easy to memorize, invoking angels or saints. For example, in England, a popular nighttime blessing asked for protection from witches, from thieves, from storms, and from grief. In other parts of Europe, charms against nightmares were more elaborate, recited in a mixture of Latin and the local tongue, blending church teachings with fragments of much older, pre-Christian incantations. Seasonal changes brought their own variations in bedtime rituals. In winter, when nights were long and bitterly cold, people layered their bedding with furs or heavy wool blankets, and sometimes even heated bricks wrapped in cloth to place at their feet. This was not purely for comfort. In an age when illness was often blamed on exposure to cold and damp, keeping the body warm at night was believed to be a crucial defense against sickness. In summer, however, the emphasis shifted to ventilation and insect protection. Bed curtains were drawn not only for privacy, but also to keep out flies and mosquitoes, which were thought capable of transmitting both disease and evil influences. In wealthier homes, perfumed waters were sprinkled on bed linens to cool the air and ward off pests. For travelers, bedtime rituals had to adapt to the road. Those staying at roadside inns often slept in communal rooms, where strangers might share the same bed. This was both an economic necessity and a matter of security, safety, and numbers was valued when lodging in unfamiliar places. Before lying down, travelers might place their belongings beneath their pillow or wrap them in their cloak for protection. Some tied small bells to their purses as a deterrent to theft during the night. In monasteries, where travel and pilgrimage often brought visitors, sleeping arrangements for guests were modest but ordered. Pilgrims might receive a simple cot in a dormitory, and before lights out they would join in the monastery's prayers, merging their own rituals with those of their hosts. Regardless of wealth or status, the medieval person approached sleep with a sense of preparation and caution. Night was not a passive state, but a passage through a realm where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual blurred. Each gesture, bolting the door, crossing oneself, arranging amulets, choosing the bed's direction, was part of a quiet choreography aimed at making that passage safely. The trust placed in these rituals was immense, for without them, sleep was not simply rest, it was exposure to the unknown. While the practical measures of bedtime, bolting doors, banking fires, arranging bedding were central to the medieval nightly routine, the more symbolic and mystical elements of these rituals revealed an underlying belief that sleep was a journey and not always a safe one. For many, to close one's eyes was to step into a liminal space where dreams could be messages, omens, or even spiritual battles. This belief infused the very atmosphere of the sleeping room, shaping it into a place that was as much a sanctuary as it was a physical shelter. Among the upper classes, a bedchamber was carefully curated to reflect both comfort and protection. Heavy curtains, often embroidered with religious symbols or heraldic patterns, enclosed the bed on all sides, creating a private cocoon where the sleeper could rest unseen. These curtains not only kept out drafts, but also served a symbolic role, shielding the sleeper from the gaze of wandering spirits. In noble households, it was not uncommon for such curtains to be sprinkled with holy water before being drawn at night. This practice was echoed, in simpler form, in peasant homes, where a small branch of blessed herbs might be hung near the bed for the same protective purpose. Dream interpretation was a significant part of medieval thought, and thus bedtime rituals often included acts intended to influence the nature of dreams. Some people placed specific objects beneath their pillows to encourage certain visions, sprigs of thyme or marjoram for pleasant dreams, small pieces of amber to ward off nightmares. The practice had roots in classical antiquity, but was adapted through the lens of Christian symbolism. For instance, a small piece of parchment with a psalm written upon it could be folded into a pouch and worn around the neck during sleep. In certain regions, dream incubation was practiced for guidance in decision-making. Before sleep, a person seeking an answer might recite a prayer to a particular saint, such as Saint Raphael for healing or Saint Joseph for wisdom, and then sleep in a designated position, often on the right side, to receive an answer in their dreams. The belief that sleep exposed the soul to danger was particularly strong in folklore surrounding the mare, a supernatural being thought to sit on a sleeper's chest, causing nightmares and even suffocation. To guard against the mare, various measures were taken, placing shoes with their toes pointing away from the bed, tying a piece of red thread around the wrist, or even sleeping with a small mirror nearby to confuse the spirit. In Scandinavian regions, it was believed that locking all knots in the house before bed could prevent the mare from finding her way inside. This fear of nocturnal assault extended to other supernatural threats, such as witches and restless dead, who were thought to roam freely after midnight. The ringing of church bells at curfew, a practice common in towns, was not only a signal to extinguish fires, but also a communal act of protection, marking the transition into the safe hours of night. Those living beyond the reach of town bells might imitate the sound by striking metal at home, a practice believed to drive away evil. For medieval healers and wise women, bedtime presented an opportunity for both preventive and restorative magic. A sick person might be instructed to sleep with certain stones such as jasper for fever or hematite for bleeding, tied in a small bag and placed under the pillow. The combination of herbs, prayers, and minerals was thought to align the sleeper's body with the natural and divine forces that governed health. Interestingly, these rituals often blurred the line between medicine and magic. While church authorities sometimes condemned such practices, they persisted among the people, reinforced by generations of tradition. The role of the family in bedtime rituals was also significant. In multi-generational households, sleeping arrangements were communal, with several people sharing the same bed or sleeping platform. This not only conserved heat, but also reinforced a sense of security. There was strength in numbers, and the physical closeness offered comfort against the vast darkness outside. Parents often taught children protective prayers, ensuring that such words became as instinctive as breathing. "Now I lay me down to sleep." And similar formulas had medieval equivalents across Europe, and though their wording varied, their purpose was the same: to entrust the sleeper's soul to divine protection. In some rural areas, livestock were also included in the scope of bedtime rituals. Stables and barns were inspected, animals were fed, and in some cases, blessed with the sign of the cross before the household retired. The welfare of the animals was essential to the family's survival, and ensuring their safety at night was both a practical and a spiritual duty. In monastic settings, bedtime was marked by the recitation of Compline, the final canonical hour of the day. Monks and nuns would chant psalms and prayers by candlelight before silently retiring to their dormitories. Silence was strictly maintained, not merely as a matter of discipline, but as a recognition of the night's solemnity. The sleeping arrangements in monasteries were austere, simple wooden beds, or pallets with straw mattresses, but the sense of spiritual fortification was strong. Each sleeper was surrounded by the invisible protection of their community's prayers. Seasonal festivals and holy days could also alter bedtime rituals dramatically. On the eve of certain feast days, families might stay awake later than usual, participating in vigils or processions. In these cases, the transition to sleep was often accompanied by heightened religious observances, such as lighting special candles or reciting longer sequences of prayers. For example, during Christmas Eve in some regions, it was customary to burn a Yule log throughout the night, its light believed to safeguard the household until dawn. Even in more ordinary times, threshold of sleep in the medieval mind was not a careless crossing. Every step arranging the bed, performing protective gestures, choosing a sleeping position was imbued with intention. Sleep was not just a physical need, but a nightly ritual of survival, a passage through a landscape where the dangers of the waking world mingled with those of the unseen. To neglect these rituals was to court misfortune, and for most medieval people, that was a risk not worth taking. In the quieter hours before midnight, when the fires had burned low and the world outside was a tapestry of deep shadow and muted sound, the medieval night took on an entirely different character. It was in this stillness that the most intimate and superstitious bedtime rituals, often unfolded, rituals shaped as much by personal habit as by collective belief. In many rural homes, the act of securing the dwelling for the night was not simply a matter of bolting doors. Doorways and windows, considered points of vulnerability to both thieves and spirits, might be sprinkled with holy water or brushed with the smoke of smoldering herbs such as rosemary or juniper. The pungent scent lingered in the cool air, merging with the smell of wood smoke, a sensory barrier as much as a spiritual one. For households that could afford them, iron charms, small, forged shapes resembling crosses, crescents, or even miniature tools were nailed above lintels, drawing on the belief that iron repelled malevolent forces. The bed itself, often the focal point of the sleeping space, was arranged with deliberate care. Among wealthier families, feather mattresses were fluffed and shaken to remove any lingering miasmas of the day. In simpler homes, straw bedding was turned or replaced entirely if illness had touched the household, the act accompanied by whispered invocations for health. Sheets, when they existed, were smoothed flat. In winter, extra blankets or fur coverings were pulled tight, the weight seen as comforting not only for warmth, but for anchoring the sleeper against restlessness. In the minds of many medieval people, the moments before sleep were a liminal time when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was thinnest. Dreams, in this framework, were more than idle wanderings of the mind. They could be prophetic visions, spiritual encounters, or even battles with unseen forces. For this reason, certain gestures before bed took on outsized importance. A cross made on the forehead, lips, and chest with the thumb was one of the simplest and most widespread protections. This motion, quick and silent, was repeated across Europe in countless variations, sometimes accompanied by the Latin phrase, "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum, into thy hands, Lord, I commend my spirit." The influence of astrology on bedtime practices was subtle but present. Some people believed that sleeping with the head pointed in a particular direction could influence health and fortune: north for strength, east for wisdom. This idea, inherited in part from ancient traditions, mingled with Christian symbolism. Sleeping with the head to the east, for example, was sometimes said to honor the direction of Christ's return. On certain nights, when the moon was new or full, those with knowledge of herbal lore might prepare infusions or charms specifically for dream guidance. These could be consumed as tea's mugwort was especially favored for enhancing dreams, or simply placed under the pillow in small linen sachets. The scent of these herbs was thought to call the desired vision into the sleeper's mind. For children, bedtime carried its own set of traditions, many of them aimed at ensuring they slept soundly through the long, cold nights. Cradle songs, often repetitive and melodic, served not only to lull, but also to shield. The lyrics might weave blessings and protective imagery alongside everyday comforts. In some regions, parents would draw a simple sign, a small cross or circle on the child's forehead with spit or ash, an act meant to seal them against harm until morning. Animals, too, were part of this protective net. In farmsteads, the well-being of livestock was bound to the family's own fortunes, and their stables were treated almost as extensions of the home. Before bed, a farmer might walk the length of the barn with a lantern, murmuring a blessing as he checked each stall. In certain areas, a sprig of protective greenery, such as holly or rowan, would be tucked into the rafters of the stable to guard against illness and theft. In urban settings, bedtime rituals adapted to the density and dangers of city life. Here, the concern was often as much about human threats as supernatural ones. Locks were double-checked, shutters fastened, and valuables hidden away. Wealthier townsfolk sometimes employed night watchmen to patrol the streets, their footsteps and lantern light a familiar comfort to those drifting off to sleep. Yet even in cities, the invisible dangers of the night were not ignored. Priests occasionally made rounds after dark to bless homes, particularly during times of plague or unrest. Monastic life, with its strict schedule and communal discipline, approached bedtime as an extension of prayer. After Compline, monks and nuns would enter the Great Silence, during which no words were spoken until morning. In this enforced quiet, each person moved deliberately, mindful of their steps, the sound of fabric against wood, the creak of beds. Sleep here was not just rest. It was another form of devotion, a surrender of the body's will to the order and rhythm of the religious day. Seasonal variations also shaped bedtime practices. In the long summer evenings, when light lingered late, people might spend more time outdoors before retreating indoors, carrying with them the sense and warmth of the day. In winter, the early darkness and bitter cold drove families to their hearth sooner, and bedtime came with an added layer of urgency to secure warmth, conserve fuel, and ensure that no ember escaped to spark a fire in the night. Throughout all these variations, one truth held constant. For medieval people, sleep was never entirely private. It was part of a collective rhythm, woven into the life of the household, the village, the monastery, or the city. The rituals that framed it, whether simple or elaborate, were a nightly negotiation with the forces, both seen and unseen, that might shape what awaited them before the dawn. By the time the first chill drafts crept through the gaps in the walls and the faint noises of the day had completely dissolved into the muffled breathing of the household, the medieval night entered its second, quieter phase. It was in these hours between the setting of the last watch and the earliest hints of dawn that certain rare, almost secretive bedtime customs were practiced. Not all were spoken of openly. Some were private family traditions. Others were remnants of older, pre-Christian beliefs that lingered in the corners of memory. In remote villages where superstition and inherited wisdom carried equal weight, the act of preparing for sleep might include locking the soul to the body. This was done by clasping the hands over the chest, fingers interlaced, and reciting a short, rhythmic phrase, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in the local dialect. The idea was simple. During sleep, the soul wandered, and this gesture was meant to tether it securely, ensuring the dreamer would return to wakefulness. If someone died in their sleep, it was often whispered that they had failed to perform this small but vital act. In wealthier homes, where the bedchamber itself was a symbol of status, rituals took on a more performative nature. Bed curtains' heavy fabrics that enclosed the sleeper were drawn close not just for warmth, but as a barrier against drafts, insects, and eyes, both human and inhuman. The folds of these curtains might conceal small charms sewn discreetly into the lining. Tiny wooden crosses, fragments of scripture, or even dried petals from flowers associated with purity and protection. The act of closing the curtains could be as deliberate as locking a door, sealing the sleeper away from the unpredictable night. For some, the path to sleep involved creating an auditory shield. In the countryside, the low murmur of a family member's voice, reciting familiar prayers or recounting harmless stories, could serve as a ward against intrusive thoughts or nightmares. In towns, where the hum of distant taverns and the occasional shout from the street could intrude, wealthier residents sometimes paid for hired singers to perform soft, slow ballads under their windows, a custom imported from courtly traditions. In certain coastal regions, the sounds of the sea were integrated into nightly routines. Fishermen's families spoke of the waves as a living presence, to be greeted before bed with a short blessing, so that no one would be called into the water during their dreams. There were also rituals bound to specific nights of the year, when the veil between worlds was believed to thin. On the eves of certai and feast days, households might place a small dish of bread and milk near the hearth or at the threshold. This offering was intended for wandering spirits, the logic being that a satisfied ghost was a harmless one. Removing the dish untouched in the morning was considered dangerous. It was burned instead, the ashes scattered away from the home. The preparation of the sleeping space could also involve deliberate alignment with natural forces. In rural areas influenced by older pagan customs, people sometimes positioned their beds so that they faced the rising sun on important dates, such as the solstices or equinoxes. Doing so was thought to draw strength and renewal from the first light of morning. Others arranged their sleeping mats to avoid having their feet point toward a doorway, a precaution rooted in the belief that this orientation made it easier for death to claim the sleeper. The relationship between bedfellows added another layer to these nocturnal practices. In most medieval homes, sharing a bed was the norm, whether with family members, servants, or even guests. To ensure harmony through the night, some households maintained a quiet rule. Disputes were to be resolved, or at least formally set aside, before lying down. This could take the form of a shared drink, a brief clasp of hands, or even a symbolic rearrangement of the bedding. The belief was that unresolved anger could fester into illness or invite restless spirits to the household. In monastic communities, the act of going to bed remained bound by discipline and humility. After the final prayers of Compline, the monks or nuns would retire to their separate sleeping quarters or dormitories, each bed modest and uniform. Here, the ritual was not one of individual superstition, but of collective submission to divine order. A final bow or sign of the cross, before lying down, was universal, and the silence was so complete that the only sounds were the creak of wooden frames and the faint rustle of fabric. Sleep itself was treated as an extension of prayer, a submission to God's will in all states of being. Seasonal hardship also shaped these rituals. In the depths of winter, with the night stretching long and the cold capable of seeping through stone and wood alike, layers of fur and wool were heaped onto the beds. Before retiring, hot stones wrapped in cloth might be placed near the feet, their heat slowly radiating through the bedding. The hiss of water poured over heated metal, the steam carrying the smell of iron, became part of the night's sensory landscape. In the summer, when heat lingered in the air, beds might be stripped of heavy layers and covered with lighter linens, often perfumed with herbs like lavender or mint to keep away insects. Through all these customs, whether humble or elaborate, there was an underlying sense that bedtime was not simply the end of the day. It was a moment of crossing, of stepping into a space where the physical and the spiritual intertwined. And for medieval people, the care taken in these moments reflected both a fear of what might come in the dark and a deep hope for the safety of the dawn. If one could step quietly into the heart of a medieval household after night had settled, what they would witness would be a choreography of small, deliberate actions, each infused with meanings that blurred the line between habit and ritual. In the dim glow of tallow candles or the warmer light of oil lamps, the bedchamber became a space of transformation, a place where the burdens and dangers of the day were deliberately set aside, replaced by gestures meant to coax rest and protection from forces unseen. Among peasants, whose homes were often a single multi-purpose room, the preparation for sleep began with the arrangement of the hearth. The embers were banked carefully under ashes, a task often given to the eldest woman in the household. This was not merely to preserve fire for the morning, but to guard against spirits or ill luck. For an unprotected flame was thought to invite wandering souls to linger. A whispered rhyme, spoken as the poker smoothed the last of the ashes, might bind the flame's warmth to the family's health. The bedding itself, straw pallets, layered with rough-spun blankets, was sometimes sprinkled with dried herbs, most often wormwood, thyme, or sage. The purpose was practical as much as spiritual, to deter fleas and lice, but also to repel malevolent forces said to ride the air at night. In towns and cities, where space was more confined but goods more varied, beds became symbols of wealth. The rich slept upon mattresses stuffed with down or wool, their covers embroidered or edged with fur. Before retiring, servants might warm the sheets with heated pans filled with coals, moving them in slow, practiced arcs beneath the fabric. In noble households, this simple act could take on ceremonial weight, accompanied by the murmuring of protective prayers, especially if the master or mistress of the house was in fragile health. In monasteries, the transition to sleep followed the unyielding rhythm of the liturgical hours. After compline, no idle words were permitted. The brethren moved in near silence to their dormitories, where each bed was arranged with exacting uniformity. Some monastic rules dictated that monks sleep in their habits, girded with belts, as a sign of perpetual readiness for prayer. In certain orders, beds were placed so that all the sleepers' heads faced the same direction toward the east, where the sun would rise, and with it, the reminder of resurrection. Yet beyond the expected, there were subtler practices, rooted in fear as much as in faith. In some regions, a small bowl of water was set near the bed, reflecting the belief that spirits were repelled by their own image. In others, shoes were left pointing away from the bed, a superstition claiming that this confused wandering ghosts, making it harder for them to find the sleeper. The bed's very position in the room was chosen with care. It was avoided to place it directly beneath exposed beams, lest they act as spiritual conduits, or directly opposite a mirror, for fear that the soul might slip out during the night and fail to return. Travelers lacking the safety of familiar walls developed their own mobile rituals. Pilgrims might lay their staffs or walking sticks across the entrance to their sleeping space, believing it would bar entry to ill will. Merchants sleeping in inns often placed coins beneath their pillows, not for theft, but as an offering to any spirit who might pass through, bribing them to move on without mischief. Among seafarers, who lived with the constant threat of storms and shipwrecks, bedtime rituals took on a tone of humility. Hammocks or shared bunks were approached with a muttered thanks for survival thus far, and many sailors wore small tokens, bits of knotted cord, seashells drilled and strung on twine close to their skin as both comfort and protection against drowning in their sleep. In more superstitious towns, entire neighborhoods might share a communal bedtime habit. On certain nights, particularly when the moon was new or eclipsed, families would place sprigs of evergreen above their doorframes and sprinkle salt thresholds. These measures, performed in the hours before bed, were thought to deter witches or the evil eye, which were believed to be more active during phases of celestial change. The intimacy of marriage added yet another dimension to nighttime customs. In noble courts, couples might exchange tokens before sleep: a lock of hair, a small piece of jewelry, or even folded slips of parchment bearing short verses or psalms. In rural areas, shared prayers or the singing of soft, repetitive lullabies served not only to soothe but to affirm unity before the long silence of night. Sometimes these acts were private bargains, with fate a way of asking, without saying aloud, that the other be spared until morning. As the final sounds of the day died away, from the bark of a distant dog to the low creak of settling timbers, the medieval sleeper entered a state of vulnerability unmatched in waking life. Every act before lying down, from the placement of a charm to the utterance of a single phrase, was a negotiation with the mysteries of the dark. And in this careful choreography of shadows and whispers, the people of the Middle Ages found not only rest, but a measure of control in a world that offered little certainty. In the most remote corners of medieval Europe, there existed nighttime customs so unusual that they were rarely recorded even in the chronicles, for they seemed either laughable or dangerously unorthodox to outsiders. In the Alpine villages, there was a tradition known as locking the shadows. Before sleep, the head of the household would walk through the home with a wooden ladle, scoop icy spring water into it, and sprinkle each corner while murmuring a specific set of words meant to keep the shadows that had followed the family members during the day from crossing the threshold at night. It was believed that during the waking hours, every person carried an invisible reflection behind them, not a soul, but something eerily close to it, and if it was not driven away, it could steal warmth and life from the sleeper as they dreamed. In the coastal settlements of Normandy, a different practice prevailed. Before bed, a small flat stone, heated by the sun during the day, was placed at the head of the bed. This stone, people said, trapped sunlight within it, and, kept near the sleeper's head, would anchor their spirit in the land of the living and prevent the strong sleep from pulling them into the land of the dead. On the British Isles, particularly in certain parts of Scotland, there are records of something called humming doors. Before lying down, the mistress of the house would slightly open the front door and run a taut horsehair string along its edge, producing a low hum. The sound was believed to drive away the night wind spirits, who might otherwise pull the soul into far-off wanderings from which the sleeper might never return. In warmer lands, such as Sicily, there was a ritual called renewing the sleep. Before lying down, one would briefly stand barefoot on damp earth in the courtyard or on the shoreline if the sea was near. This act symbolized returning the body to its natural strength and cleansing it of the day's fatigue. There were darker traditions too in certain parts of Eastern Europe. People believed it was necessary before bed to touch 3 times a coffin board kept in the household. This was meant to appease death itself, for it was thought that each night death would walk among the houses deciding whom to take. By touching the board, one tricked it into thinking the person was already prepared, and so death might pass them by. At the great river mouths where trade routes crossed paths with lingering pagan beliefs, it was common to light small clay oil lamps before sleep, placing them at the threshold and letting them burn to the end. The light was said to be a bridge between this world and the world of spirits, but also a ward to keep the sleeper from wandering into dangerous dreams. Some of these customs might sound like pure invention today, but in the context of the medieval worldview, they made perfect sense. The night was not simply a time of rest. It was a dangerous border beyond which forces operated that humans could neither control nor fully understand. And so every movement, every object, every word uttered before bed carried weight, and these rituals, no matter how strange they might seem to us now, were threads in the fragile web that separated safety from the unknown. If you listen closely to the medieval night, not only to the creak of rafters and the sigh of banked embers, but to the quieter murmurs that live behind them, you will hear 2 voices speaking at once: the physician and the priest, the handbook of health and the book of hours, each telling the sleeper how to cross the darkness safely and wake whole. For in that age, sleep belonged as much to medicine and theology as it did to habit and fear, and every gesture before bed could be read like a prescription or a prayer. Physicians wrote of sleep in the language of humors. Warm and moist, they said, like spring after rain, beneficial when taken in measure and at the right time, dangerous when excessive, corrupted when the stomach was overfull, and treacherous when the night air was foul. The good sleeper, advised the regimina sanitatis, should dine early, lightly, and on foods that soothed rather than inflamed barley pottage, soft eggs, tender greens, wilted in oil, while avoiding hard cheese, old salted meats, onions and garlic in quantity, red wine taken hot, and any food that stirs choler, for these would twist the dreams and thicken the chest. After supper, walk, they said, not with haste but in a gentle circuit about the yard. Then sit by a small fire to warm the stomach, comb the hair to draw vapors upward, and delay the bed for an hour so digestion might begin its invisible labor. If the body remained restless, take a draught of posset, warm milk or ale with honey and a pinch of nutmeg, or a sprig of rosemary steeped quick in hot water, or, where the purse allowed, hawthorn and violet and a little wine, for these calm the heart. Yet the other voice, older, narrower, and sometimes louder, warned that sleep softened the guard of the soul. Confess what can be confessed before you lie down. Make peace where anger has kindled. Say the psalm of protection. Cross the bed, cross the brow, and commend the spirit to the Maker, because the hours after midnight belong to examination, when the conscience wakes even as the flesh grows heavy, and temptations come in the form of dreams. Images half rememberet, fast is half forbidden. The mind wandering where the feet may not go by day. To such things the priest attached both pity and rule, recommending prayer beads kept on the chest, a relic in the headboard, the habit of sleeping on the right side, as the heart is guarded, and, when shame visited unbidden, the morning's absolution to lift what the night had laid down. Between these two authorities, the learned and the devout, there ran a thread of practice thick enough to hold the whole household. The room itself was arranged as a remedy, for if night air was a thief of health, then shutters were physicians, bed curtains apothecaries, tapestries more than decoration. Box beds in the north were built like wooden coffers with sliding doors to keep heat and miasma at bay, and their carved lintels bore ivy, lilies, little crosses, all medicine to the eye. In cities, where the alleys held heat and stink, men burned juniper or rosemary before sleep to cleanse the room, then hung vinegar-soaked linens to sweeten the breathing, a domestic fumigation that belonged as much to the market stall of the spice merchant as to the chapel font. Launderers, those quiet engineers of comfort, knew the weight of sleep too. The smell of fresh linen was the scent of health, though linen itself was dear. Households counted sheets like coins and washed them in lye made from ash, beating them in rivers by day, so they could cradle rest by night. To drive the small armies that plagued the bed, women stitched sachets of wormwood and mint into seams and dusted mattresses with fine sand, then brushed the slats with vinegar and salt. A well-tended bed was not a luxury but a prophylaxis, and when famine or plague came, the first kindness after bread was often clean cloth, the coolness against fevered skin, like a prayer made visible. Not all sleep came willingly. Some needed coaxing, and here the boundary between remedy and charm grew beautifully indistinct. Poppy heads simmered low in milk, a chip of nutmeg shaved into honey, a finger's breadth of wine warmed with clove, a few leaves of lettuce steeped to release their quiet virtue. Or, for the desperate, a whisper of henbane smoke waved under the pillow. Though even the boldest healers warned against too much of that bitter comfort, mothers rocked possets and prayers together, swaying at the bed's edge, tapping a slow rhythm on the frame so the body would learn the song of surrender. And because dreams were not debris but messages, households curated them, like letters. Artemidorus and Macrobius, read in monasteries, taught the ranking of dreams, phantasm, vision, oracle, while village dream books glossed the symbols for layfolk. To dream of water might bring news, of teeth a death, of ladders a change in fortune. To invite the right dream, one placed mugwort under the pillow or a bay leaf touched to the tongue, or slept with a psalm pinned to the shirt, And on St. Joseph's night, some would rest upon the left side, that wisdom may come as in a whisper to the heart. Night terrors had their own taxonomy. The mare that pressed the chest, the hag that rode the breath, the incubus who turned desire into dread. To these the manuals offered both bile and blessing. Avoid heavy meats. Vent the room. Cross the bed. Tie a red thread around the wrist. Set iron at the threshold. Leave shoes pointing outward. And if the assault persisted, ring the small bell to wake the house and drive the weight away with witnesses and candlelight, for shame thrives in secrecy and loosens under eyes. Cities added civic medicine to the private. The curfew bell was not only fire law, but a pulse-setting instrument, telling kitchens to hush their flames, telling shutters to close, turning streets into corridors of sleep so that hearts might beat together toward morning. The night watch with staves and lanterns became, in time, a kind of lullaby measured feet on cobble, the brass rattle's brief complaint assuring the sleepless widow or the nursing mother that order did not entirely dissolve in the dark. In the courts of the rich, the regimen grew ornate. A barber's surgeon might bleed a restless lord in the afternoon to lighten the head. A physician might prescribe a syrup of violets, quince, and sugar to cool the collar at dusk. Servants would warm sheets with brass pans, sprinkle rosewater on the pillows, and lay a thin slice of lemon by the bedside to sweeten the breath and settle the stomach. Yet even here, with carved testers and beeswax candles, the last gestures returned to humility. A psalm whispered through silk curtains, a palm braid from Easter tucked into the canopy, the sign of the cross traced on the linen where the head would lie. Monasteries turned the whole of night into pedagogy. Compline closed the mouth, matins opened the ear. The cold stone of the choir at midnight kept the body honest and the mind awake to mysteries. Novices learned to make a pillow from obedience, to fold hands the same way each evening so habit would become harbor, to bear wakefulness not as failure but as offering, while the infirmarian kept a chest of simples near the dormitory, valerian root, dill water, fennel seed knowledge as charity measured by spoonfuls. Mariners, shepherds, muleteers, those who slept where the world itself kept moving, adapted the regimen to the road. A sailor slung in his hammock, with a knotted cord around his wrist to remember the living. A shepherd lay along the lee of a wall and tucked his cloak like a second skin. A muleteer turned his boots uphill under the blanket, so that if he woke in fright, he would see their stern toes and remember the mountain. Each crafting from scant materials, the feeling of enclosure the housebred took for granted. There was even an economy of silence. In households that could afford many servants, the steps after curfew were wrapped in wool. Keys were carried on ribbons so metal would not kiss metal, and great households hired ushers of the bedchamber, who moved like breath and kept night's order as carefully as day's protocol. To disturb another's sleep without cause was an ethical failure, for a tired body was a leaky vessel and let illness and irritation through. Seasonal advice braided itself through these counsels. In winter, pile weight on the limbs, for the heaviness calms the animal spirits, and earthy blankets pin the soul kindly to its house. In summer, trade weight for breath, hang damp linen for coolness, and scent the room with mint to rouse the appetite at dawn. In plague years, fear the night air most of all, burn vinegar on the coals, shut the shutters before dusk, and sleep low to the floor, where the corruption is said to rise more slowly, though the truest defense remains charity and distance. And always there was the moral of measure. Too much sleep thickens the humors and tempts sloth. Too little gnaws the wit and leads to rashness. The right sleep, taken at the right time, with the right preparation of stomach and spirit, keeps the memory bright and the temper even, and turns the dreams from snarled briars into gardens through which one can walk and learn. If, at last, you stand in such a chamber at the moment before the lamp is snuffed, you can feel the two voices settle into one cadence, the physician's rules tucked into the priest's prayer, the curtain drawn like an eyelid, the sheet smooth like a page, the body turning onto the right side, The hand finding the small object at the throat bead, badge, scrap of saint's cloth not as superstition only, but as the human wish to bind the unknown with a thread of custom. Then the ember is covered. The latch is tested. A breath is taken as if tasting the room for harm, and the sleeper crosses over, carried by remedies and rites together, trusting that the anatomy of the night, its bells, its herbs, its linens, its whispered absolutions will deliver them back to the morning, with the heart untroubled, the spirit unscalded, and the body ready again for light. In the medieval imagination, night was not an empty span to be crossed in oblivion. It was a territory, populated and patrolled by forces both benevolent and malevolent, and the rituals before bed were not mere habits, but strategies for surviving until dawn. The very air of darkness was suspect. Physicians warned of the corruption of night vapors that seeped through open shutters, carrying fevers and bad dreams, while preachers spoke of the devil's liberty after midnight, when sins long resisted could slip through the defenses of the mind in the guise of visions. Between these two warnings, ordinary people learned to treat bedtime as a liminal passage, like crossing a dangerous bridge. There were steps, words, smells, and gestures that had to be put in order. The bed itself was the first line of defense. In peasant homes, mattresses were often sacks stuffed with straw, rushes, or dried leaves, changed seasonally to keep away fleas and mold. Wealthier households used feather beds, heavy and warm, which were shaken each evening to fluff the filling and scatter pests. Beneath the bed, people placed protective items: a small knife or pair of shears, a horseshoe, or an iron key, objects thought to repel spirits that crept low to the ground. At the head, a sprig of rosemary or rue was tucked into the bed frame, for scent and safeguard alike. Bed curtains were more than decoration. Drawn tightly, they trapped heat and shut out both drafts and prying eyes. For some, they symbolically enclosed the sleeper in a sacred space, a private sanctuary against the chaos outside. Clothing for sleep followed its own logic. In colder regions, people wore long linen shifts or woolen night tunics. In warmer seasons, some preferred to sleep naked, believing that the skin should breathe at night. Yet even this was hedged with caution. Sleeping unclothed was acceptable only if one was properly covered, lest the body be struck by the night air. Children were often wrapped snugly, both for warmth and to prevent restless movement. Before climbing into bed, a washing ritual was common. The wealthy used warm water scented with rose or lavender. The poor might simply rinse their hands and face in cold water from a basin. This was partly for cleanliness, but also symbolic, washing away the dust and sins of the day before presenting oneself to God in the vulnerable state of sleep. In monastic houses, this washing was paired with the recitation of compline prayers, the last office of the day, which emphasized penitence and peace. Some even slept with a small crucifix under the pillow or wore a pouch containing relics or blessed herbs around the neck. For those in urban centers, the sounds of curfew shaped the transition to rest. When the bell rang, signaling the extinguishing of public fires, windows were shuttered, doors barred, and the streets emptied. The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the measured steps of the night watch or the occasional call from a sentry. This enforced stillness gave the sense of a world collectively folded into rest, each household enclosed in its own bubble of darkness. Yet silence was never complete. In rural areas, the night was filled with natural sounds: the lowing of cattle, the bark of dogs, the rustle of leaves in the wind. These were familiar and reassuring. More disturbing were the noises without clear source: the creak of wood when no one walked, the faint tread of feet in the loft, the muffled thump of something falling in the yard. Such sounds were interpreted according to the mood of the hearer. On one night, they might be dismissed as the settling of beams. On another, they might be taken as signs of witchcraft or the wandering dead. This is why many households kept a candle and flint at the bedside, ready to be struck if fear overcame sleep. Dreams, too, were anticipated and managed. People believed they could be shaped by what one did or thought before bed. To invite good dreams, some recited specific psalms or placed an open Bible near the head. Others avoided thinking of sorrow or anger, for these emotions were thought to sour the dreams and leave the mind troubled at waking. In villages, dream interpretation was a regular conversation. An image of a bridge might foretell a change in fortune. A dream of losing teeth often meant death in the family. Seeing birds in dreams could predict visitors or messages. It was common to share dreams at the morning hearth, seeking both reassurance and guidance from others' interpretations. Certain nights of the year were thought especially dangerous for sleep. On the eves of major feasts, when the barrier between the earthly and spiritual was believed to thin, extra protections were put in place. Charms hung at windows, salt sprinkled in doorways, prayers said twice. The same caution was taken during storms, when thunder was believed to be the sound of demons driven from heaven or of God's wrath striking the earth. In such times, some preferred to stay awake altogether, passing the night in quiet tasks or silent vigil. Even the position in which one slept was guided by rule. Many believed it best to sleep on the right side, with the right hand under the cheek, imitating the posture of Christ in the tomb and keeping the heart high. Sleeping face down was frowned upon, as it was thought to invite bad dreams and even suffocation. Couples sometimes slept apart for practical reasons, to avoid the sharing of illnesses, or because certain holy days demanded chastity even within marriage. For those in high places, lords, ladies, and clergy, sleep was often a performance as much as a necessity. Visitors might be impressed by the richness of the bed hangings, the scent of imported herbs, or the soft weight of furs. Servants prepared the bed with ceremony, smoothing the sheets, warming them with brass pans filled with embers, and laying a small token of fruit, a sweetmeat, or a folded handkerchief on the pillow. Yet once the guests were gone and the curtains drawn, these same high-born sleepers lay just as vulnerable as the poorest peasant to the unpredictabilities of the night. In all cases, sleep was both an end and a beginning, a closing of the day's chapter, and the opening of a new, uncertain page. Whether approached through medicine, magic, religion, or habit, the act of going to bed was never casual. It was an art, a defense, and a leap of faith into the unknown hours, from which one hoped by God's mercy, by careful preparation, or by sheer luck to return safely with the coming of the light. If the preparations for bed in medieval life were deliberate and layered with meaning, then the night itself was an unpredictable landscape, sometimes restful, sometimes fraught with interruptions that turned the hours of darkness into a series of small dramas. Sleep was rarely the continuous, unbroken block we imagine today. Instead, medieval people often slept in two distinct phases. The first sleep began not long after nightfall, when households settled and the fires were banked. This period might last 4 hours, after which many people naturally woke. The middle of the night, called the watch or the dead of night, was a liminal interval. Some used it for quiet prayer, others for small chores, mending clothes, tending animals, or checking that the house was secure. Married couples sometimes spoke intimately or even conceived children in these hours, believing the body to be at its most fertile and the mind most relaxed. The second sleep followed, carrying the sleeper toward dawn. This segmented pattern was so common that medical texts advised what to eat and drink between sleeps, and certain prayers were written specifically for the waking hours of midnight. Yet not every night was peaceful. In towns and villages alike, nocturnal disturbances were common. Dogs barking in the distance could signal a wandering stranger or, in more superstitious interpretations, a spirit passing through. Cats were watched with suspicion if they prowled too actively. Many still associated them with witchcraft. On windy nights, the creaking of shutters, the sighing of thatch, and the moan of the wind through keyholes could feel like voices whispering in the dark. Thieves favored darkness, and so did those bent on mischief. Urban households trusted the night watch to keep order, but their lanterns reached only so far, and in the poorer districts, crime was a constant worry. A faint knock at the door in the small hours could provoke panic. Few would answer without first calling out to demand the visitor's name and purpose. In rural areas, danger might come from animals rather than people, wolves, foxes, or wild dogs scavenging near the byre. For this reason, barns and coops were built close to living quarters, and men kept weapons or heavy staffs within reach of the bed. Night was also the favored time for those who sought to harm others by supernatural means. Cunning folk and witches alike were thought to work their charms when the world was still. Milk could sour overnight if left unprotected. Bread dough might fail to rise if a jealous neighbor cast the evil eye upon it. People took such possibilities seriously enough to protect their goods before bed-covering food with blessed cloths, locking barns, and making the sign of the cross over their household stores. Sickness, too, seemed to strike hardest at night. Without the distractions of daylight, pain felt sharper, fevers burned hotter, and breath seemed harder to draw. Caregivers kept vigil over the ill, dozing in chairs or on pallets by the patient's side, feeding them sips of broth or cool water. The flicker of a single candle or rushlight became the only anchor in the shifting hours. In monasteries, the rhythm of night was shaped by the canonical hours. Monks and nuns rose for matins often around midnight, filling the dark with the sound of plainsong. In the great churches, bells rang out across sleeping towns, their echo carrying over roofs and rivers, a reminder that while most slumbered, the prayers of the faithful never ceased. This blending of the sacred and the everyday meant that even ordinary sleepers could feel part of a wider pattern, their rest framed by a structure that spanned the entire community. Weather could dictate the night's character as much as human activity. In winter, heavy snow muffled all sound, making the world outside seem impossibly far away. In summer, windows were left open to admit the cool night air, bringing with it the sense of fields, flowers, and sometimes the less welcome odors of dung heaps or stagnant water. Rain on a thatched roof was a lullaby to some, but to others it was a source of worry, each drip a potential sign of leaks. Lightning storms in particular were feared for their spiritual implications. Many believed thunder was God's voice or the battle cry of angels against demons, and lightning could be an omen sometimes good, more often bad. Fires were a constant concern. A single overturned candle or ember from the hearth could engulf a timber home in minutes. This fear was one reason for curfew laws and the careful banking of fires at night. Some families kept a small lantern burning in a safe niche as a nightlight, both for convenience and to ward off spirits, for it was said that darkness was the devil's cloak. Not all nighttime activity was fearful or solemn. There were occasions when night brought joy, late feasts, weddings, or wakes that carried on until dawn. Torches and lanterns would turn streets into glowing corridors, music and laughter spilling into the dark. These nights, though rare for most, were reminders that darkness could be claimed for celebration, as well as for rest. Eventually, the approach of dawn brought a change in the night's mood.